Hello, hello, hello. It is chapter 5 of The Divide. Here we are, debt and the economics of planned misery. So in the last chapter, we covered the era of independence for many countries in the global south and the ways in which democracy was oftentimes subverted in countries that attempted to undo the global economic system that had been put in place under colonization. So in answering the larger question, why are some countries rich and some countries poor, that we're dealing with in this unit of the class, we have a major answer, of course, in the long history of colonization, both in terms of dispossession and in terms of deindustrialization and in terms of course, slavery and extraction of resources. That's part of the story. But a major portion of it is the way in which each country got slotted into a particular status in the overall global economy, either as a peripheral nation, as a core nation, and whether or not they were able to produce, allowed to produce something more than raw materials or very basic manufactured goods. So that system put in place under colonization then starts to unravel with independence, but the pushback from the global north to sort of reassert their role as core nations and push global south countries back into their role as peripheral nations was swift. So now in this chapter, we're going to focus on another piece of the puzzle. We've got colonization, we've got anti-democratic and democratic undermining in the era just after independence of many countries. And now we're shifting to the question of debt. So the era of debt is parcel to the larger economic moment in time that is still dominant till today. It's unraveling at the moment. It's unraveling as I speak. But this era of neoliberalism, which has attempted to reassert a colonial relationship between countries in the global north and countries in the global south in the name of free trade, and through the auspices of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. We'll be talking about the IMF and the World Bank in this chapter and the WTO going forward. And these ideas are, neoliberalism, are associated largely with the theorist, as we talked about last time, Milton Friedman, who I showed you a photo of him sitting with General Pinochet, the brutal dictator in Chile who took over from the democratically elected Allende with the help of the United States. So just again to reiterate the overall arc of the explanation about why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, we have a long era of colonization, we have a very short era of independence, and then we have the reassertion of a colonial economic relationship without the trappings of direct colonization that existed in the era of colonization from the 1490s up until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, depending on which country you're talking about. Namibia only got its independence in 1990, etc. But that general era that started in after World War II and then has ended largely in terms of economic independence in the 1980s. So that big picture to set all of the rest of this in. So developmentalism, of course, was a response to the problems caused by colonization. So colonization reordered local economies in ways that concentrated ownership of resources and profits in the hands of just a few people, colonizers, and forced everyone else to work in ways that would produce raw materials, and at very low wages or no wages in the case of people who were indentured or were enslaved. So when independence came about, as I mentioned in the last chapter, the solution was to undo that economic and political system that had concentrated so much ownership of wealth and resources and power in just a few hands, and to redistribute the land, the ownership of resources, and the access to power to everyone, rather than to just the few colonizers for whom everyone else worked. So this solution brought with it a variety of policies that were implemented across these newly independent nations and nations that were able to become a little more economically independent of the United States because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's moving away from older policies of direct economic control, if not political control. So they started to nationalize key resources. They started to redistribute land, take it away from the people who owned massive quantities and give it out to people who owned none. And they also started to protect the local economy in ways that would allow for industries to develop that could ultimately compete with outsiders, and put in place labor protections that would allow people to earn decent wages and not be exploited by working for too long or into dangerous circumstances, and then also offer a bunch of important services that can then help the society get forward, like education and healthcare and basic housing in many cases, and poverty reduction measures. So this is what developmentalism did, and as we know from the last chapter, it succeeded in not only drastically reducing poverty and hunger in former colonies, but also growing the economy. The economy actually grew at a much faster rate under these policies than it did under colonial policies of extraction. So at the same, in the same era as we talked about in the last chapter, we saw the non-aligned movement arise. So throughout this video, I'm going to throw up a few questions that you are likely to see on the final exam. And I'm doing this just to get you thinking about, okay, do I know the answer to this question? So you might want to pause and write an answer to it to see whether or not you are up to snuff with the answers that I'm going to give you for the questions that I'm going to throw out throughout the video. So here's your question. What was the non-aligned movement, which we talked about in last chapter? And what did it succeed at, which is a little bit more in this chapter. So the non-aligned movement, as I mentioned last chapter, started in 1955, led by Nasser and Sukarno and Nkrumah and Nehru, and it then went on to propel this initial non-aligned movement, went on to propel similar kinds of connections and bonds between former colonies in the name of helping themselves to rise against the power and wealth of the global north. So for example, in this era, there was the creation of a cartel called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which started out being mostly Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, but it has expanded since then. And the idea was that by working together, these countries in the global south could withstand better the economic pressures from the global north. They could cooperate with each other rather than being pitted against each other by countries in the global north. And also in the same era, this era of developmentalism, the non-aligned movement very smartly got together 77 of the world's poorest, least developed countries and joined them in the United Nations in what was called the G77, the group of 77 nations. And over time, that group of poorer and less developed countries, former colonies, has grown. So a group that is cooperating with each other, everyone's talking together to try and forward a shared set of goals as former colonies and as countries in the global south. And that has grown since the 60s to 134 countries today. In the same era, there was also something called NEO, which was created, the New International Economic Order, which wanted to see not just a change in power, but in the rules of things like trade, the rules of industrialization and patents and agricultural production. Wanted to see a lot of transfer of technology from the global north, the former colonizers, to the global south, the former colonies. Wanted to see that form of help in moving forward. So the non-aligned movement did quite a bit to organize countries in the global south. So this wasn't just independence at the national level, but then all of these new nations that were independent of their former colonizers coming together, cooperating, and creating a form of solidarity that could help them then have a bulwark against the global economic order that had slotted them into raw materials production and into being consumer markets. Okay, next question for you. So, how did wealthy countries in the global north respond to the non-aligned movement and these other forms of solidarity in the global south? What was their response, and how did they take it that these countries were trying to share their political power with each other and safeguard their own economic interests? So part of the response of the global north was led by Henry Kissinger, the long-term United States Secretary of State. And Kissinger helped form what is known as the G7. It became the G8 when Russia joined it after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now they've been kicked out again after invading Crimea. And so it is again the G7. But this was initially formed in 1975 in response to everything I just told you about what the Global South was doing. And it involved basically the biggest economic powers, all of them, except for Canada, former colonizers, or indirect colonizers in the case of the United States. So US, UK, France, Italy, Japan. You're saying, wait, Japan colonizer? Yeah, Japan colonized Korea, of course. Germany and Canada. So this group of powerful and wealthy countries had they got together specifically to figure out a way to respond to and check the growing power of countries in the global south. And their primary strategy, not surprisingly, was a divide and conquer strategy, where Kissinger proposed that they would go to the least developed countries, LDCs, the poorest of the poor, and they would try and chip off their support for the G77 by offering them aid and loans. So basically they would buy them and then take their votes away from the global south in United Nations votes. But the G7 persists, as does the successor institution to the G77 till this very day. Okay, next up. All right, so we have the rise of the Global South, this exciting moment when the Global South is getting their independence. They're starting to change the economics of the globe so that they're no longer kept down in the same way that the world system had kept them down under colonization. They're starting to work together to get power, and both at the UN and in terms of trade and creating cartels to be able to better control the price of the resources that they are that most of their economies are founded on. So it seemed like things are going really well. Their growth rates are really rapid. As I've said, poverty is declining and education levels are rising and health lifespans are rapidly increasing. All these great things are going on. What went wrong? Like, why did that not continue? Why do we not have today a story of a closing gap of wealthy countries and poor countries? Why do we have still that ever increasing gap of wealthy and poor countries? part of that story is or what started that story is the third world debt crisis. So the G7 under Kissinger started chipping off poor countries one by one, but that was a difficult way to get power wrested away from the G77. So it turned out that a debt crisis was what did their work much faster for them than attempting to divide and conquer as they had been doing. So what precipitated the third world debt crisis? And if you can answer that question, then you are well on your way to being prepared for the final exam. So the start of the third world debt crisis is with Israel's Six-Day War in 1967. And in that war in 1967, which is right in this era of developmentalism, right? It's right in the middle of this era. They invaded and took land that is now Gaza. They took the Sinai Peninsula, all of it, from Egypt. They took over East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria. So Israel, in 6 days, just expanded out and took over a large chunk of territory around it. And it stayed that way until 1973, when the Arab states surrounding it, Egypt and Jordan and Syria, with support from other Arab nations, they struck back and they attempted to retake the land that Israel had taken in 1967. And they had not planned on the United States stepping in to arm Israel to the extent that it did. And so as Israel was losing ground to these Arab states that were fighting back, the United States started shipping in massive amounts of weaponry to Israel, and Israel defeated the Arab states that were attempting to retake the land that it had taken in 1967. And out of anger toward the United States for its role in this defeat of Arab nations in 1973, OPEC, that cartel that controlled oil prices that I mentioned a minute ago, decided to raise oil prices. Initially, they did some direct targeting of initially they just rose prices for the globe as a whole, and then they started to do direct targeting of the United States as a punishment for the United States' role in the war. And so oil prices just shot through the roof, and there were long lines at all the gas stations in the United States. People were extremely angry, and as a result, the United States got Israel to give back much of the territory that it had taken in the 1967 Six-Day War, and the Arab states lowered their oil prices once again. So there was oil diplomacy that went on in response to this 1967 and 1973 war. But as a consequence of that oil diplomacy, because remember, OPEC had raised prices on oil as a political tool, not as a market response to demand, right? But everybody needed oil, and because of the interconnected global economy that had been set up under the world system, there was a lot of there's not energy independence, right? Everyone was all connected in ways that made them vulnerable to this kind of price gouging. But as a result of that price gouging, OPEC suddenly was crazy flush with cash. They had just massive amounts of money that came out of nowhere because they had shot the prices up, not in response to anything other than their desire to punish the United States. They suddenly had, in 1974 terms, so this is trillions now, $450 billion that they didn't know what to do with, because there weren't, since it was gained so rapidly, there weren't places that it could be easily invested all at once in the global south, or at least they were convinced through Kissinger and these negotiations that took place at the end of the 1973 war, that they were convinced to take this money that they had won through the oil embargo and invest it in Wall Street, give it to Wall Street to invest on their behalf to make money for them. So it's at this point that Saudi Arabia becomes an ally of the United States. And it's also at this point that Wall Street is suddenly flush with cash, where they also don't know where to invest it because the United States and Europe, their economies are stagnating due to, as we talked about in the last video, due to those natural internal conflicts that capitalism always comes up against, internal limits of problems like consumer demand. So their economies at this particular moment, when there was a ton of money to invest, at that moment, the economies of North America and Europe had stagnated. So Wall Street looked around, realized that the economies in the global south were, because of developmentalism, growing really rapidly. At the same time, the global south had been harmed by this price gouging of OPEC as well, because everybody needs oil, not just the United States. And they had to pay massive rates for oil, and they had to take out loans to pay some of those costs for oil that they weren't anticipating. And so there was this double thought on the part of Wall Street. One, the global South's economies were growing faster than the economies in the global North. And two, they have this new need for cash to meet their obligations for the loans they took out to pay for oil during the oil embargoes. So at this moment in 1974, there arose what's called go-go banking, which is predatory loan pushing at the global level. So this is something similar that happened in the United States before the crash of 2007, 2008, where predatory loan officers went out and sought to give loans to people in the United States who had no business having loans, who had no collateral for those loans, who didn't have proper income for those loans, and they gave them at incredibly high and variable return rates. So their interest rates were really untenable, unsustainable, but they were enabled to give those kinds of toxic loans, bad loans, because there was a lot of cash that needed to go somewhere, and there was a lot of demand to create new loans in a way that was really unstable. And this happened in 1974 at the level of countries rather than individual borrowers. So Wall Street bankers went all around the globe giving pitches to countries in the global south about how great these loans would be and how clearly they would be able to afford them by using manipulated statistics that were misleading at best and sometimes straightforwardly inaccurate. And the bankers were incentivized to do this because they were not on the hook for whether or not these loans got repaid. They were only incentivized to sell loans, not to sell sustainable loans or loans that were tied to reality. And so these bankers were giving loans to countries on falsified terms, falsified in the sense that they were misleading the countries into how sustainable the loans would be. At the same time that they are getting a bonus for every loan that they sign. So in the minds of the bankers at this particular moment during go-go banking, there is no reason not to get a country like Niger to sign up for a loan that it can't afford, or get a country like Bolivia to sign up for a loan that it can't afford. There's no downside for the bankers because every loan that they get a signature for, they get cash in their pocket, and they don't have to worry about whether or not Bolivia can repay. So this created a moment of shift in the history of the economies of the global south, in that they started to get on the hook for high interest rate and variable interest rate loans that were, in the best of circumstances, difficult, but then given what happened next, really impossible. So these are subprime loans, just like you could think of subprime loans in, prior to in 2006, 2007, that created the financial crisis. But they are for nation states. So national debt in the global south, instead of starting to look better and better as countries got independent, it started to skyrocket. So in just a very short period of time, because of the particulars of the interest rates that were given and what's called the Volcker shock, when the United States raised its interest rates, which are the base for all of the other interest rates that were being given by Wall Street, the debt in the global south quadrupled. It's times 4 between 1974 and 1982. And so in less than a decade, 4 times the national debt. So based on the chapter, what these loans were used for and whom they mostly benefited. So pause it for a second and write down the answer to the question. What were these loans used for, and who did they benefit mostly? So in addition to looking at the overall 4 times the debt from 74 to 82, in some countries the debt increased as high as 50% of the gross domestic product. So the total of what was being produced in a year, the total value of what is being produced in a year in that country, 50% of that was needed for debt, to pay off the debts that had been recently accrued through go-go banking and the Wall Street predatory loans. So it's not that the money for these loans was used to invest in the country and build infrastructure, or pay for research, or get new industries off the ground and industrialization. So it didn't develop the local economy. Instead, countries in the global south got into a debt cycle in which they were just taking out more loans to repay the old loans. And as interest rates increased, this just became its own suck on the economy, and added nothing to the global economy, just drained it. But oftentimes not only the bankers and their investors in the global north profited, but oftentimes so did the elite of the countries that had also taken shares in these loans, or had shares in or had other ways of getting profits from these transactions, like backroom deals that helped them get wealthy as they signed on to loans that their countries couldn't afford. So dictators, many of whom were put in place, as we learned about from last chapter, through coups or assassinations, or undermining democratic elections, such dictators actually got a lot of money for agreeing to sign on to loans that their countries couldn't pay for. And they didn't care, because they didn't have to answer to anyone, because they weren't elected, so they couldn't be kicked out of office. So they were happy to sign these loans, and they got a lot of money as a result themselves. So these did not benefit the everyday people. They did not benefit the economy. They did not benefit local industry. Instead, they benefited the banks and the bank's investors and the kleptocrats, the dictators who had signed on to these loans. So from the book itself, a visualization of the exponential curve of the debt crisis in the global south. And as you know, this is the magic of compound interest, right? This is how compound interest is, how it operates. It operates exponentially. So if you get into these kinds of debts, they only grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. You can never fully pay them off. You're never getting to pay off the principal because you're always just paying off the interest. And therefore, the debt continues to accrue. Maybe some of you have experienced this with high interest credit cards. So this is happening to entire nations who are on the hook for loans that they're oftentimes, sometimes democratically elected, but oftentimes their dictators took on. So as a result of this moment of go-go banking, investing the money that OPEC stashed away as a result of wars with Israel, then the third world debt crisis created massive profit ultimately for the banks in Wall Street, particularly because these loans are denominated in US dollars. And since the entire global economic system up until today, it's now starting to teeter a bit, but since the entire economic global system is founded on the United States dollar and on the United States Treasury in the form of bonds and the rate at which the United States lends money through the bond market, then when the United States raised its interest rates in 1981 through the Volcker shock to address its own inflation problem, which was also driven in part by the oil crisis, then it's not just the loan rates in the United States that shot up, but when the United States raises its own interest rates, then all of the national debt of other countries that is premised on the US dollar also shoots up. So as a result of this third world debt crisis and this spiraling debt that accrued so rapidly with these rapidly increasing interest rates, Mexico came forward in 1982 and said, enough. We cannot. We are so underwater with these debts. We will not repay. We're going to instead default. And Brazil and Argentina said, yeah, that makes sense. Actually, we're going to default too. We're done with this debt. We're just not paying it back. So, of course, Wall Street freaked out. And rather than taking the lumps for having given out loans that were really untenable, so rather than just having to take the consequences for making bad business decisions in giving out terrible predatory loans, they went to the United States government and said, we cannot have these countries not repaying their debt. You, United States government, so this is business telling government, must get them to repay their debt. So Wall Street tasked the US government with getting their profits back for them. So that is exactly what the United States government did. And the United States government took the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, two entities that it had a veto power in by virtue of the fact that it had a very large share of the decision-making power, some 16%, I believe, 16, 17%. So the US essentially has ultimate control of the IMF. It went to the IMF and the World Bank, and it tasked them with addressing the concerns of Wall Street in making these countries in the global south repay the bad loans that have been given to them by Wall Street. So, question that you might come up across on the final exam. In this era, the 1980s, neoliberalism, what changed with the IMF and the World Bank and why? So remember, we talked about this earlier. Initially, when the IMF and the World Bank were set up, they're under Keynesianism right after the end of World War II. The IMF was set up to create global financial stability, to make sure that no country could collapse financially and then cause a cascading problem that would create a global depression. And the World Bank was set up to end poverty. So to keep financial stability and to end poverty. Those were the two initial reasons for establishing these organizations. But neoliberalism changed the nature and the orientation of these organizations. Under neoliberalism, they became instead the arm of the US government to first force countries in the global south to pay back the debt that Wall Street had given them, and then remake the economies of those same countries. So what were their three primary policy goals, which were highly aligned with the theories of neoliberalism that were circulated by Milton Friedman and his acolytes? See if you can answer this one already. So when Wall Street went to the US government and said, hey, we can't have all these countries defaulting, they have to pay us back, the United States government went to the IMF and said, hey, you got to do something. Go around, make these countries pay back Wall Street. The IMF said, okay, this is what we'll do. We will go in, we will offer them new loans to pay off their old loans to Wall Street. And in return, we will impose on them what we will call structural adjustment plans, SAPs. So rather than allowing them to default, we will make them reorient their economies towards paying off their debts to the World Bank, not to the World Bank, sorry, to the banks in Wall Street, and to the extent that they are taking out loans from the IMF and the World Bank directly, also from the IMF and the World Bank. So loans in order to pay off old loans, but with a whole bunch of strings attached about how the economy has to be reworked. That is what structural adjustment plans are. And the three primary principles of those structural adjustment plans, as driven by the ideology of neoliberalism, that is the set of ideas that make neoliberalism what it is, that everything should be privatized, everything should be liberalized, or also known as deregulated, and there should be austerity, fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity means what is spent. Fiscal is what the government spends. So there's monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the budget that gets spent. So privatize everything the government owns, liberalize all of the rules, and don't spend anything. So let's get into a little bit more detail on those. Austerity. So what does it mean when you don't spend anything, fiscal austerity? It means you do things like you fire all of the government's workers so that you can then not spend money on their salaries, or sometimes you take back their pensions and refuse to give them a pension. You also cut spending on services that you're giving to your people. So you stop spending money on education. You stop spending money on healthcare. You stop spending money on poverty reduction. You stop spending money on infrastructure. You're not building more roads and power lines to get people electricity. Instead, you are taking all the money you have and using it to pay off your loans from Wall Street. So that's austerity. Slashing budgets every which way, wherever you can, in order to hold on to the money that the government is spending, so that all that money then gets redirected towards loan repayment. Privatization, what does that look like? So as a stipulation for receiving these loans that would help them pay off their old loans, so these new IMF loans, the IMF said you also need to all those natural resources that you nationalized after you got your new independence, we want you to sell those to multinational corporations. So your oil, your copper resources, your uranium resources, your whatever it is that the country happens to have, we want you to sell that off. The public shouldn't be owning anything. All ownership should be private instead. So if we were to do that here in the United States, that would be things like, and we have done some of it, of course, in the era of neoliberalism, but it would be doing something like Cal State Long Beach should not be publicly owned. It should be sold to a private university, and it should be run on a for-profit model rather than as a public service. And the national parks should actually be sold. And then the private owners of those national parks can use them as they like, whether that's for mining or whether that's for tourism. Healthcare. So this sounds a little odd because most healthcare in the United States is not public, but we are an exception in the world. Around the world, just like education is offered as a necessary public good, so too healthcare is often offered as a public good. And just like everybody can go to kindergarten for free, everybody can also go to a clinic for more or less free. So selling off public government hospitals and clinics and training facilities for doctors, making those all private instead. And public utilities. This is something that happened quite a bit under neoliberalism in places like the United Kingdom and the United States. Services and things that everybody needs, like electricity, like railroads, like telephone lines, telephone services, even roads, started to be sold. Things that were owned publicly by everyone for everyone's use were sold and then made private and turned into profit as opposed to the public good. So this has happened to some extent in the United States, but through the structural adjustment plans imposed by the IMF in response to the third world debt crisis, these were imposed in a really serious way in the global south. Many countries just forced to make a wholesale sale of their publicly owned natural resources. Happened in Russia as well, right after the end of the Soviet Union, which is what created the oligarchs that we have today. A few key people owning all the natural resources. Liberalization and or deregulation, they really are kind of the same thing. They're usually used, liberalization is usually used to talk about like the money markets and finances, and deregulation is usually used to talk about industrial regulation like labor and like pollution and things like that. But ultimately, they're all the same thing. They're deregulation. It's like the rules that the government puts in place to stabilize the economy, to keep people from being exploited, to make sure that people have enough money in their pockets. All those Keynesian principles we talked about earlier, roll those back. So don't have minimum wages. Don't have laws around if children can work or not, and when they can work, or how long people can work, or under what conditions people can work. Don't have rules about whether or not a outside foreign investor can invest their money and then take their money out, or invest their money and take their money out, which is called hot money. People like throwing their money into different markets around the world for a quick return, but in ways that they destabilize local economies, because you can't plan and build and grow an economy with money that goes in and out rapidly. So roll all those rules back, just allow the world to come in and do what they like in your economy in order for them to be incentivized to arrive and make profit for themselves. So make it more amenable for outside foreign entities to play ball in your country by making them better able to exploit your workers, exploit your resources, and exploit your economy, your financial sector. So liberalization, deregulation have led to things like this collapse in Bangladesh of a factory to make clothing that you buy in places like Walmart and Costco here in the United States. And in this collapse of a a factory that was not well regulated, so there wasn't a lot of oversight as to how it was built. 1,100, that is 1,100 people died. This was, I believe this is 2015, 2014, not that long back. So, privatization, deregulation, and fiscal austerity. These were structural adjustments that were put in place by the IMF and the World Bank in return for loans or in return for aid for big projects, which is how the World Bank largely operates, over and over and over again in country after country after country. So we've seen decades of the results of structural adjustment plans, SAPs. What have they looked like? Like what have we seen as a consequence of these decades of neoliberal structural adjustment? If you were to enumerate the consequences, the evidence for the outcomes, what would you write on the final exam? So the outcomes for people in the global north have been pretty great. We have seen a much higher return on investment in these loans given to the global south than we have on things happening here in the global north. And when I say we, I do mean we, because the organizations that buy shares of these loans to countries in the global south include pension plans for people like me here at Cal State Long Beach, right? I don't control what goes into my pension. And I'm not saying that the people who run my pension directly are interested in, global south debt. But global south debt does pay a higher return, higher yield. So I would not be surprised if that is in fact how they are doing their investing. So this is not individuals who give these loans, right? These are banks in which you can buy shares of their financial products, which include a portfolio of things like debt in the global south that was facilitated by the IMF and the World Bank. So we've seen a high return on investment in the global north for that debt. And the principal on those loans has still largely not been repaid, even though the global south has repaid those loans 3 and 4 times over, 5 times over in some cases. They've paid the amount over and over and over again, but because of that lovely magic of compound interest, they're still not even touching the principal. They're still only paying interest. And so we've seen billions and billions and billions of dollars of profit from these loans in the global north. And as I mentioned, wealth for the dictators in countries that have taken these loans. And we've seen this exciting for wealth, for wealthy countries, this exciting transfer of resources like oil and copper to multinational corporations. So it's been a great benefit to countries in the global south. And if you note, this is essentially, again, colonization, right? If they've been forced to sell their copper mines to a Glencore out of Switzerland, then it ends up being like the system of colonization that existed prior to independence as well. And we've also seen a whole new swaths of global labor that has enabled this integration of supply chains that has taken jobs from the global north and given them to cheaper workers in the global south who are not protected because they're not allowed to be protected by laws that create minimum wages, because the IMF actually has disallowed that kind of regulation to take place. So part of the problem for workers here in the global north is that workers in the global south are disallowed from being protected by wealthy interests in the global north. So we're pitted against each other, and then outsourcing happens in ways that, it's not the only reason why outsourcing happens, but this is part of the story, is that labor is so cheap elsewhere, in large part because Labor is not allowed to be more expensive elsewhere because the IMF doesn't allow for that kind of regulation in a meaningful way. It doesn't allow for unions to develop, for example. Also we have all of these new consumer markets because the IMF and the World Bank have made, and WTO as well, have made those newly independent countries lower their tariffs that they had put in place to protect their new industries, to allow them to develop so they could then compete. It's made them take those tariffs away in ways that then allow for consumer markets that are easier to compete in the global south. But as you well know, these structural adjustment plans have not been good for everyday people in the global south. Good for wealthy people or some wealthy people in the global south, but not good for most everybody else in the global south. So once this era of neoliberal structural adjustments came into play, you started to see the growth rates in these countries in the global south fall precipitously, very rapidly, as they had started to climb under developmentalism. And the share of wages within that growth, GDP, has dropped dramatically. So even whatever growth is taking place, even though the growth has slowed, the percentage of wages vis-a-vis that growth is less than it once was. And unfortunately, we did see rates of hunger and malnutrition start to increase under these structural adjustment plans imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. And then overall, there's been this, just like there's been that massive increase in or exponential increase in debt in the global south, there has been a related curve, exponential curve, in the increase in inequality between the global south and global north, which had started to rapidly decrease during the era of developmentalism. So you will not be surprised to find out that people in the global south have not taken this lightly, right? They're dictators or people who had, basically been forced into taking these loans out of fear of being couped or assassinated if they didn't comply with what the IMF was demanding of them in the interests of business in the United States and in Europe. Though those people have taken loans that the everyday people in their countries have had no part in getting to speak to beforehand, right? So they didn't take a poll in Bolivia and ask people whether they wanted their water to be sold off, privatized to Bechtel. That nobody got asked beforehand, right? It was just done by the people in power at the top at the behest of these structural adjustment plans by the IMF and World Bank. So people have then across the world for starting in the 80s, but really building in the 1990s and 2000s, they've come out in these massive protests against their government that are also against the IMF and the World Bank. As you can see here in many people's signs, they're explicitly decrying the fact that their government has been forced by the IMF to do things to the economy that have been so painful to them personally, that they've lost their jobs, or they don't have enough wages, or they can't afford the price of bread, or they can't afford the price of water. So there have been repeated IMF protests across the globe for decades. It's not always that people know exactly why the things are as bad as they are in their country, so they don't always protest directly at the IMF, but oftentimes they do as well. But of course, as we know, the IMF is not beholden to the people of any of the countries that it imposes these economic systems on. It's not democratically elected, right? So it doesn't care if people come out and protest. The people who work for the IMF who impose these policies, they can't be touched. And Even though many countries, many people have tried to sue the IMF for the terrible consequences of their policies, the courts have never upheld them. So the IMF has been always allowed to stay off the hook for taking any responsibility of the terrible economic consequences of its structural adjustment plans as they have been implemented time and again over many countries. Okay, so this debt that came kind of out of nowhere right after the oil crisis and then created, and that was facilitated by go-go banking and predatory loans to these oftentimes dictators or quasi-dictators, puppet elected officials, and then got reinforced with structural adjustment plans that kept these countries in this debt and made the debt only spiral out of control rather than get it under control. Should countries in the global south actually be forced to repay these debts that Wall Street started giving them under, questionable terms and with questionable pitches, sales pitches? So it's not just the original loans, but it's also since then the ways in which countries that come up against a crisis then getting backed into a corner by the IMF and forced to do things that are really non-beneficial for their economy. So should these loans that have oftentimes been repaid multiple times over and that continue to exist at high interest rates, should countries in the global south be forced to repay them still? I often hear students or other people say, well, you have to repay a loan, right? It's just sort of this moral obligation. If you've taken a loan, then you have to repay it. And there's several ways in which I find that problematic as an answer. One of them is that who's the you there? You didn't necessarily take a loan that your dictator government took because they got rich from it, right? But you're having to repay it through all of these hardships on your economy. So who's the you? But also, why should a loan that was given immorally be repaid on moral grounds? If the loan itself was not financially sound, which these initial loans absolutely were not, then in like pure capitalist terms, should not the lender be on the hook for that poor transaction? That's how it ought to be. That's how it ought to have been with people who had to go bankrupt during the mortgage crisis of 2008, right? But that's not who was that's not who was given redo this. It's not the banks who made these terrible loans that are held responsible for their actions. It's instead the borrowers who are held responsible because the US government has always come to bail out these banks, both in the case of the third world debt crisis and in the case of the financial crisis of 2008. So that sort of tips the whole balance of the morality of debt in the first place, in my mind. If a loan can be given in such a way that it is can be given without any relationship to financial reality, because you know that the government will come in and bail you out, then how moral is that loan in the first place? So I am in favor of canceling the debt of canceling predatory loan debt of countries in the global south for many reasons. Partially because I think they were immorally given in the first place, and that the United States should not have backed up Wall Street on terrible loans. But also, I feel like if we want to solve the problem of poverty itself, this is a necessary step towards ending the misery that is experienced in the global south. Debt cancellation is a piece of that larger solution. So personally, I am in strong favor as a solution to misery, ending misery. I am in favor of debt cancellation in the Global South. All right, so rehash. What are structural adjustment plans? What are their elements? Who imposes them? Where are they usually implemented? What is their economic priority? And what has been their primary outcome? So pause for a second and see if you are able to answer each of these without listening to me first, because then you'll know that you understood what we have just gone over. Okay, so what are the elements of structural adjustment plans? They're primarily focused on privatization of publicly held resources, austerity, so cut government spending and reorient that spending towards loan prioritization, loan repayment, and liberalization or deregulation, making things easier for foreign businesses to make money in that country. Who imposes them? International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Together, they are called the Washington Consensus, and they have worked in concert with each other since the start of this era of the 1980s in this neoliberal implementation of structural adjustment plans. Where are they usually implemented? Global South. That's not to say there's no place in the Global North that hasn't taken them as well. Greece has been on the hook with these structural adjustment plans. Other countries in other less developed countries in Europe as well, but they're largely implemented in the Global South. What is their priority? They have a single priority. That is to reorient the economy of the nation that is taking out this loan towards repaying its old creditors. So that is always the first priority. Whatever is happening with the money in that country, top priority must be to pay off international loans. And what's been the outcome of these three elements that have been implemented in the name of prioritizing the repayment of loans for foreign investors or foreign lenders? Primary outcome has been globally increased poverty in the Global South and greater inequality between the Global South and the Global North. There have been many other outcomes, but that's really the big one. We've seen global inequality skyrocket and poverty in the Global South also really increase. Okay, so back to that big picture view. We go from colonization to independence to a new form of colonization. You can call it neocolonialism, where foreign entities from outside the country are coming in and they're able to purchase the natural resources, exploit the local workers, and repatriate profits without paying taxes locally because of the structural adjustment plans that the IMF and the World Bank have put into place. So the IMF and the World Bank have been extremely successful at quashing the era of developmentalism in which countries in the Global South started to rise. They put them back in the place they were in under the old colonial world system. All right, that is it for this chapter, and we're getting very close to the end. So be sure that you are on top of all of this. Go back and review any of the things you didn't quite understand, and hit me up or come to my office hours to explain to you the things that aren't making sense to you. Send me an email, or my office hours, so come on by and see me, and I'm happy to explain anything that isn't fitting for you.